Well, if we know that the divine is not to be found encompassed in elements or aspects of the creation, the sun, the moon, the stars, the sea, the land, then obviously we don't worship aspects of creation. Which leads to the last part of the first commandment regarding the existence of the divine and the fact that it is God who is giving us these commandments. And this last part is quite a mouthful. You shall not make for yourself an idol or a likeness of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters beneath the earth. You shall not bow down before them, or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, bringing punishment for their parents' wickedness on the children of those who hate me, down to the 3rd and 4th generation, but showing love down to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. In other words, we don't worship creation or created things. We worship God, who transcends creation, and God is an invisible God. And so we're not to make from our own skills idols that we carry around, and in which we can see a certain control of the divine, that the God is where the idol is. It's where we move it. The idol is what we sacrifice to as the divine. But no. We are to recognize a God who transcends creation and is in fact the source of creation as God the Creator. Now, at the time the Hebrews received the Ten Commandments, they lived in a world in which you saw multiple cultures with multiple gods and goddesses and multiple images to those gods. They saw that in Egypt while they were slaves. They would see it in Canaan. Eventually they would see it in the cult and culture of Babylon and Persia, Greece, Rome. Even they themselves, in the book of Exodus, fall into that practice in developing the golden calf and declaring this to be the God that took them out of Egypt. But in our world today, we don't see that kind of idolatry like they did in the ancient world and in the stories of the Bible, like the great golden statue in the book of the prophet Daniel. And yet, nonetheless, we can see a kind of graven imagery, or a golden calfism, if you will, that we may fall into, perhaps without even knowing it. And here's how we can at times. There's an old saying that states, God made man in his image, and man being a gentleman returned the compliment. In other words, we create God in our image. And you find that in the practice of many who will often negate or nullify much of God's law with the notion of, well, I don't believe God will punish me for this. I don't believe God would punish me for that. On one occasion, I remember seeing two religious leaders on a talk show discussing, and in some cases debating, traditional morality and more progressive morality. And one of them said to the other at one point, well, that may be the way your God is, but my God isn't that way. And that, I thought, was very telling. It's almost as if they're splitting God into a God that I worship as opposed to a God that you worship. And it reminded me that both of these men, and perhaps all of us, to one degree or another, need to be told, there is no your God. There is no my God. There is only God. And we must accept and worship God as God is, not as we would have God be. And in many ways, we do have not a physical image, but an image that is a product of our imagination, in which we create God to be something a little more palatable to us, something that doesn't make us quite as uncomfortable, or perhaps does not require that we change our lives to conform more to the standards that God gives us, for example, in the Ten Commandments. And we'll make a reference to, I think God is this way. But it goes back to the first part of this commandment. I am the Lord your God. You are not the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me, or any graven images, including the ones we conjure up by our own imagination, and our own subjectivity of what we think God should be. And here again, it harkens back to the words of God to Moses from the burning bush when he says, I am who am. What's important to note is what God doesn't say. He says, I am who am. I am not who you would have me be. And so again, this part of the first commandment is still just as relevant. We may not be bowing down to physical idols of gold and silver and idols of beasts and other ancient pagan gods, but we can nonetheless fall into a kind of golden calfism in which we are worshiping the God who gave us these commandments, but we're worshiping a tailored God that we've adjusted to suit our own fancy and our own imagination rather than accepting God as God is. I am who am, not who you would have me be. I am the Lord your God. You are not. You must not have other gods before me or any graven image. And it is from that first commandment and all that's encompassed in it that we go forth to the rest of the commandments that God gives us in the Decalogue.